I don't know why we're whispering. Like, I can just edit this out.
It's more fun this way.
Welcome to Task Time Energy, the purpose-filled productivity podcast, where we sometimes talk about time management skills and productivity techniques, but more often we talk a little more philosophically about how we think about time and how we perceive time and ways that we can use the time that we have in a purposeful and fulfilling way. My name's Scott Miller. I'm your host. Thanks for joining us. Welcome, everyone. Our very special guest today is my wife, Lauren Greene. So, Lauren, I'm going to sing your praises a little bit, and then you can add anything you want to add or correct me if you want to correct me. So, Lauren, you are a very experienced K-12 educator. You've taught science in high school. You've taught science in an elementary school. Your specialty is environmental education. You worked at the Dunwoody Nature Center near Atlanta. You also worked for the Red Wolf Coalition here in North Carolina. You now are the Youth Environmental Education Specialist at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. What did I miss?
Quite a few jobs, but that covers the gist of it. Environmental education as well as classroom education. And my focus has been K-12, but also teaching the public in general. Mm-hmm. All ages.
All ages. Teaching all ages about science and the environment. So a topic, and you and I have talked about this a lot, but a topic that I'm very interested in and that I've been interested in discussing with someone on this podcast is the whole idea of how we teach time management to kids, or how kids learn to organize their tasks and manage their time. So that's an interesting topic for me because it's something that I struggled with when I was a student, when I was younger. And yeah, I'm just really interested in hearing what your experiences have been, or just any thoughts or ideas that you have about it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. As you know, I did, in a lot of ways, I did really well in school. You know, I was in a gifted program in elementary school. I generally got good grades. And I was one of those kids who was able to do really well without having to try hard. Most of the time, if something was easy or interesting, I would just do it. And if it was hard or boring, I would put it off until the last minute and then do it at the last minute, or sometimes not do it at all. So what I learned, one of the big things that I learned when I was in elementary school, middle school, high school, is I learned to procrastinate. And what I realized later on, years later, is that when a kid is considered, quote, smart, and you're not turning in assignments or you're turning in things late, people consider it to be a discipline problem. Like, nobody said to me, hey, do you know how to study? Do you know how to organize your work and sit down and start doing a task that you're not really interested in doing and get it done? And I think it would have really helped me for somebody to do that. And I'm just curious, what your experience has been with that as a teacher.
I don't think that those skills are taught nearly often enough in schools. I do believe part of it is because the teachers weren't taught that. It hasn't been modeled for them. It's certainly not modeled well in the graduate education classes I took. Mm-hmm. A lot of what being a teacher is not actually what's taught to you in school. The skills that you actually need, the skills that you want to reflect onto your students aren't what you're taught to teach. You're taught to teach the curriculum. You're taught to teach reading and math and science and social studies. You're not taught to teach how to learn, how to study, mm-hmm. how to manage your time, mm-hmm. How to be a kind person. A lot of that as a teacher, you just have to figure out, or you are lucky and have good models that you've seen, whether it's other teachers or other people in your life.
Yeah, it's interesting you said it. It's just interesting that you're talking about the difference between what you're taught to teach and certain things that are really important that aren't necessarily taught, and then it's interesting to me, the fact that it doesn't seem to have changed much. Like the idea that kids are just supposed to know how to do certain things. Like you know how to study and you know how to plan. And I think some kids do in one way or another pick that up. And I guess as a teacher too, it's the same thing. It's the same thing for teachers. There are certain things that you're just expected to know, like how to teach kids how to study, or it's just not considered important. I don't know. What would you say it is? Is it that you're expected, if you get to the point of being a teacher, that you know how to do that and know how to teach it, or is it just not considered important or not thought about?
I don't think it's not considered important. I think there's a lot to being a teacher, and there's just not enough time to teach it all. But there are also some classes that are better than others. And to take a step back to say where I'm coming from, so my undergraduate degree involved studying animal science and then ending up with a degree in business management focused on entrepreneurship. So I've been an educator my whole life, but I started out as a dog trainer, which eventually shifted to environmental ed, which eventually shifted to a master's degree in secondary science education. So I've taken a lot of education courses, but I also haven't gone down the same exact path that a lot of teachers go down. So I can't speak completely about all of that, but I can speak about the teachers I've seen and known and the classes I did take. And unfortunately, as it is with all education, a lot of times it does come down to the teacher you have and the course that you take. There's certainly not enough focus that I saw on things like how to teach your students how to study. And I don't think it's taught early enough. So there's definitely some of it involved, especially by the better teachers. I mean, some of it is just, it's impossible to manage a classroom of 20 or 30 students without teaching them some organizational skills, because that's how you function as a class. One of the things that's missing is making those connections. And I think it's one of the bigger challenges as an educator, because we don't always think about it, but explaining that why piece. So you've got your yellow folder for reading and your red folder for math, but you don't tell the kids why that they put their reading assignments in the yellow folder and their math assignments in the red folder, and how they can use that in the future.
Okay, now you've got me interested. Why do we put the reading assignments in the yellow folder and the math assignments in the red folder?
Well, it's just an organizational technique. I mean, you've got a teacher that uses different color folders for each topic, each subject in school, so that you're organizing things by color. It's easy to say, oh, it's reading time, grab your yellow folder. Unless you have a student who's colorblind that doesn't know he's colorblind, but that's a story for another day. Right. But like in teaching high school, I taught earth science, which is typically mostly 9th and 10th graders. And in that class, I was taught by the teacher, my mentor teacher, to do notebook checks. So the students had a notebook, and they kept all their assignments in order. We gave them a list of what should be in there. So they had their notes, they had worksheets, they had labs, all the different things we did in class were supposed to be kept together in a notebook in order. And we would do notebook checks, literally just checking to see if the paper was there. Mm-hmm. Have you kept track of your papers? It didn't even have to be complete. It just mattered whether or not they had all the things. And it would be a spot check. You wouldn't be checking every single piece of paper, because as a teacher, you don't have time for that. But it was a way to help them stay organized and know that when it came to, okay, you need to be studying this material, where's that material? Mm-hmm. And I don't think even I, when I taught that class, would have thought to explain we're doing notebook checks to make sure that you have what you need to learn this material, to study for the test. And I do know, speaking of the same class, like we always talked about, and it was in the syllabus we gave them, that, every night you should be studying vocabulary or reading part of the chapter. Like there were always conversations about you can't wait until the last minute. And trying to think as a student and as a teacher, I feel like some of that's not concrete enough or not given in very specific, realistic chunks of, telling somebody to read a chapter tonight or whatever. That's a lot. And it's not likely to happen. I mean, I still very much remember one of the few books I did not read for English class in high school. It was a very long book, and I don't even remember how far I got into it, but, frequently you would be given an assignment like, read this book by this date.
Right.
Well, if you didn't like the book, it was a little hard to delve into the 300 plus pages without somebody breaking it down into a schedule.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is the kind of thing that I'm thinking of that maybe seems like it could be taught in a little more detail. Like, okay, you have this assignment. How do you break this assignment down into smaller pieces? How do you schedule your time? Figure out how much time you need to spend per day to get this assignment done that's due a week from now or something like that. And things like that seem like they would be really useful. And that even, as a coach, that I help adults with, because maybe they've heard it, but they don't really maybe see the value of it. Or there's always the difference between hearing about something and then actually doing it. Until somebody prods you a little bit and says, hey, this would really help with this problem that you're describing. There are a couple of things that you mentioned that I think are really interesting to circle back to. The idea that we don't necessarily explain the why, right? Because I can think, of myself being a student when I was in high school or even in college, and a lot of these things that were assigned, we just get the impression that we have to do this because the teacher says we have to. We have to do this because the professor says we have to, right? Like you have this vague idea that there is a reason for it, but basically you're just doing it because you're told to do it. And there's not necessarily that message that comes across that, hey, some of these things we're having you do are actually useful and will help you, not, now and in the future. Like the way that you organize your folder, the way that you organize your notebook. There's a reason we do it this way. And if you understand why we do it, there's actually a lot of benefit that you can get from that. And maybe some kids just pick up on it, but if it's not explicitly explained, then yeah, that's going to go right by, a lot of people. With my experience teaching, I've always taught adults. And I think there's maybe a little bit more of a need to explain why, because some people will just ask you like, so why do we have to do this? Which I love as a teacher. I always love that. Like, wow, that's a really great question. I'm glad you asked that. But I think maybe, kids, whether we're talking about elementary school kids, younger kids, whether we're talking about high school age or younger, teenagers or younger, you're not going to get that tendency for them to ask those questions. And if the teachers don't think to mention it or to explain it, then yeah, there's a lot of potential learning there that's just going out the window, or missed opportunities. I wonder too, like I've heard recently, just in different conversations or in passing, people mentioning that kids are actually being given classes or instruction in how to study, in time management, how to structure your homework. So it seems like there's starting to be an awareness of that and people recognizing a need for that. Have you seen any of that, or are you familiar with any of that?
I have. And before we move on to that, I just want to add, not only with the why of their doing it, but making sure that why makes sense to who you're speaking to, and whenever possible, connecting it to, as teachers say, real life. So life outside of school. Why is this important? Not just in this classroom, but how am I going to use this in the future? When am I going to use this yellow folder, red folder technique later? and explaining like this is something you can use yourself in your other classes or at home, and how that keeps applying. And I think onto your other statement there about there are, I think, more classes out there now on study skills. The biggest reason that I know of for there not being more focus on helping students with time management and study skills is that teachers aren't given the time to teach it.
Mm.
There is so much pressure on teachers to get the standards that they're given taught. You have to teach this material in this time. And more than that, it's they have to be prepared for this test. Mm-hmm. If you want me to go off on a rant, I can talk to you about testing in this country and how much harm it does to our students and our kids and our teachers, and that it's not the best. It's not the best tool. It's not the best way for students to learn. It's basically a waste of time. Yes, tests have their place. They are an important way to evaluate and assess where a student is and how you can help them learn that material. But it's got to be one piece of the learning process, and it's become such a focus in this country. It's absurd. You're creating anxiety issues. You're teaching kids to hate learning because school and learning is now associated with these tests, that the teachers have so much pressure on them that they're putting pressure on the students, and then the students are that much more upset and worried unnecessarily. Nobody in my adult life has ever asked me how I did on the Iowa Basic Skills test that I took in elementary school. Mm-hmm. The more we focus and narrow what we teach our children, the less they are learning.
Yeah, because what you're saying is, we hear over and over again from teachers is just the overemphasis on standardized tests in this country, and how it limits teachers, and exactly everything you're saying, the pressure that it puts on teachers to try to, conform to this schedule and cram all this information into the kids' heads and get them ready for these tests, where there's this whole other conversation about how useful and relevant the tests even are to begin with. And yeah, the limitation that creates and the way it prevents teachers from being able to teach a wider range of subjects, and subjects that may be more useful to students in later in life. I mean, you hear conversations from people, from adults, saying, man, I wish that when I was in school, they had, we had a class on taxes. Mm-hmm. Or on, finance, like basic finance, how to create a budget, how to, all these things, life skills. There are a lot of adults saying we should be doing this. And I wish they had done this when I was in school. And that's not going to happen until we back off this, overemphasis that we have on standardized testing. Yeah, you're definitely not the only person who's saying that. I'm sure the kids, the students themselves also feel the same way. You mentioned earlier, you have a master's in education from North Carolina State University.
That's right.
And I'm curious about, in the education classes that you took, mm-hmm. how much were you exposed to information about, because you mentioned that one of your mentor teachers when you were teaching in high school, when you were teaching earth science in high school, helped you with some of these like notebook checks. Mm-hmm. How much was that taught in your master's program about teaching students or helping students with time management, with study skills? How much of that were you exposed to?
I'm thinking through all my classes, and it definitely wasn't a big part. A lot of my classes were really focused on teaching science. Mm-hmm. And teaching science is different than teaching reading or math or social studies. And so the classes focused more on the best methods of teaching science.
So it sounds like when it comes to this, when it comes to these topics of time management and study skills, study habits, developing effective study habits, developing effective, which let's just call that what it is. That translates into developing effective work habits as an adult, right? And it sounds like there's this like vicious cycle, almost a self-perpetuating cycle, where you have teachers who are just relying on their own knowledge and abilities and maybe aren't explicitly taught, even in a, like a master's program, how to help students who are struggling, who don't know how to do that, right? Or how to just teach it in general. Let's spend some time, teaching kids how to do this. Now you go in and get into the classroom and you may have kids who are struggling with this. And because of these pressures that are put on teachers, the pressures to teach this curriculum that basically just prepares students for these standardized tests, the pressures of larger and larger classrooms, right? Because now teachers are being put into classrooms with more and more kids because you have overcrowding in the schools and all these other pressures that are being put on teachers. So there's just not time maybe for, even if a teacher wanted to spend some time on this, it would be a challenge to do that. And it sounds like this hasn't really changed, but you have this aspect where when a student isn't turning in assignments or they're turning assignments in late, it's considered a discipline problem, right? You are being a bad kid, right? Not like, hey, maybe this is something that you need to be taught how to do and you just haven't learned how to do yet. And so that's just the cycle continues. Yeah, is what it sounds like. Is that how it seems to you? Did I summarize that, you think, correctly?
I think somewhat. I mean, I hate to generalize to that level.
Well, that's a good point, because that is, I think, heavily based on my own experience, which is limited and biased because it's my own experience. But so how much of that would you say is accurate, and what would you add or change?
There's a piece missing. Somewhere in our education system, there's not enough focus on this. In education, there is talk and push for making real world connections, but it's not even explained what that means, like that, and explaining what even is meant by that, how you do that with a class, giving examples of how to make those real world connections of any content, whether it is time management and studying or math. What does that look like? Those concrete examples that a student can then relate to. If your real world example doesn't connect with that student, then it's not going to help anybody.
That does seem like an important piece. I'm thinking of a conversation I had with a parent not long ago who was talking about a situation where I think their student, their child did have an opportunity to take some type of time management or study skills class. But the problem was that the kid looked at that almost like punishment, or almost like they were being put in some kind of remedial class. And so the kid was resistant to doing it, which makes total sense. I totally understand that from the student's perspective. So connecting it to, the real world, connecting it to beyond school, getting that message across to kids that, hey, these are skills that you're going to use for the rest of your life. And the better you get at them now, the better you get at structuring your studies, planning your studies, figuring out how you're going to do an assignment if you're really not that excited about it. The better you do at that now, the better you learn to do that now, the easier it's going to be later on when you're in college or when you're out in the working world or when you're out trying to start your own business or whatever it is. Like these, it doesn't stop when you end with school. That, I have to do my homework, the dread of having to sit down and do it. That's not going to stop when you get out of school, because that's going to carry over into other things that you have to do as an adult.
Very true. That's very true.
Those things that we need to do around the house here that, it's like homework. It's just like homework.
Well, I had a training I had to do for work. It was online and involved just reading web pages of information. It was not super exciting. And, it took me a while to get motivated to do it. And one of the ways I got myself motivated was I'm very lucky and I work in a very beautiful garden and can go sit outside and work. Mm-hmm. So that's how I got through it, was I went and sat outside with my computer instead of at my desk, and made it slightly better.
Yeah, things like that. Thinking about where you're working. Would it help to change where you're going to do this? Playing music. I mean, some people say that they study better when music is playing. I've heard some people say that they study better when the TV's on, which, I guess I wouldn't argue with somebody who can point to the results and say, yeah, listen, I get more done. I get my assignments done and I get better grades when I leave the TV on in the background. But these are, things to think about.
Yeah. And it's tough because a lot of the things that would be the most helpful for students, especially now thinking more about my high school students, are things that are often against the rules. Like you said, playing music. So I played music in my classroom a good deal, but I also had students that asked if they could put headphones on, like that would come to me and say, like, I really can focus and concentrate better with headphones on and listening to my music. And I let them do that. And I am certain that if a principal had come into that classroom, that student and me would have gotten in trouble because this child was, listening to their own device in class, and it helped the student. So I think that's part of it too, is that behavior management piece of students and rules that make a classroom safer sometimes or easier for the teacher can get in the way of learning.
Yeah.
And it's tough to find the balances and the right ways to do things. I was actually thinking about some students recently I had, and rules that I bent for them. I had a very smart senior in my earth science class that's usually freshman. And he was taking, I think it was 2 AP science courses. It was at least 2 other AP classes. One of them I know was science. And he had an A in my class. He never dropped below an A in my class. I didn't care what he was doing in my classroom as long as he kept his A. He had an A. He wasn't just passing. He had an A. So he would be doing his other homework. He's still doing schoolwork, but he wasn't always paying 100% attention to my lectures or reading when they're supposed to be reading. But one of the more impressive parts was I'd be asking the class a question. He's got a totally different textbook open in front of him, and he answers the question without even looking up. He was on top of it. He understood it. He knew the material. And I've heard too many stories of, I failed this class because I didn't do all the homework, but I got A's on the test.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines of, like, I knew the material, I understood the material, but I didn't get a good grade because I didn't check off all the boxes.
Right.
Why are we teaching children that they have to do everything only this way to be successful? They're showing us how they can manage their time. This student wanted to manage his time by focusing on the classes where he needed more time. He got the readings done. He knew the material. He got it all done. But his way of managing his time best included working on other classes during my class sometimes. It wasn't always. It wasn't every day.
Yeah.
But why am I going to punish him for figuring out what works best for him?
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because, it's interesting this situation that you're describing where you have a student who's making good decisions, who's making responsible decisions. And so many teachers would punish the student for that or not let the student do that. In general, schools and probably not even because I went to a private school for 1 year, again, limited experience, but I would say this applies to both public schools and private schools as well. They're very institutionalized. And what I mean by that is there's an emphasis on conformity and uniformity.
Yes.
Right. And
Yes.
to a certain degree, I mean, maybe some schools allow a little more creativity, a little more creative thinking, creative teaching, and promote that. But to some degree, our educational system is anchored in that conformity and uniformity. And, I know when I'm working with clients on time management, when I'm coaching people, one of the things I always emphasize is this is an experiment. Like I'm not going to give you a one size fits all solution because that's not effective. What I'm going to do is help you figure out what works for you, because there are different techniques and different approaches that work. Some work better for some people, some work better for others. Yeah, that's another interesting aspect of it, is that even when maybe students are trying to do things their own way and they're making responsible decisions, how often do they get discouraged from doing that? Or how often are they not allowed to do what's something that's actually going to be helpful for them, when realistically experience shows that as adults, we need to do that a little bit. People have different ways of working and different ways of managing their time and managing their tasks that work for them. But for now, I will say thank you, Lauren. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk about this. A lot of the stuff that you mentioned, I think, gives me some new things to think about for sure, and hopefully will be helpful for other people or give some other people food for thought as well. Whether you're a teacher or whether you are a student or a parent with a student, going through school right now. It's a lot of people, I think, have an interest in this, and just, in society in general. I mean, if we want a functioning society, we need to be teaching people how to function. So this is a part of it.
Yeah. And as a teacher, we have to go back and wrap up and hit our high points, our summary, because you've got that part, but I got to get my part summarized.
Yes, absolutely.
So the takeaways. As a teacher, making those connections, but we're also thinking now in our minds, not just as a child student, but even where you are now in your life, however old you may be, to make those connections of how things apply to the rest of your life. How can you use that yellow folder, red folder system in other parts of your life? And I can tell you right now, my filing cabinet at work has different colored folders that are categorized, because why not? Colors are fun. And it does make it easier to know that all the blue folders are camp, and all the red folders are school field trips. But it's about finding the system that works for you, and finding the why and the connections for that system, and helping our children create good study habits and time management skills, and explaining to them why they're doing what they're doing and how that's helpful. Kids are never too young to understand the how and the why. They question things for a reason. They want to know. They also can usually handle the truth.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway, really emphasizing that idea that, hey, this is about more than just, you have to do this homework because we say so. It's about creating habits that are going to help you for the rest of your life.
Exactly.
I would like to ask you the same question that I've been asking everyone who comes on this podcast. What is your dream right now?
The first thing that came to mind is not going to make nearly as much sense to your listeners as it will to you, but I dream of a fenced-in backyard for my dogs. Oh. And I won't explain all the backstory to that, but that is a dream that persists, is a fenced-in backyard for my dogs.
And one of those dogs is sitting here right next to us looking at me, waiting for me to take her out. So I think that is our cue.
I think so.
Thank you, dear. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
As I mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in the topic that we were discussing today. Traditionally, people have spent a lot of time talking about the subjects that we teach students in school, reading and math and science. But maybe there's a benefit in spending more time talking about how students learn how to study. Are students being taught how to manage their time, how to plan and organize their homework and the tasks that they have to complete? Are they being taught how to do that, or are they being left mostly to figure it out on their own? If you're an educator, if you've been listening to this conversation and you're thinking, man, I would love to get in there and join the conversation and share my ideas and share my experiences, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email. It's scott@scottmillercoaching.com. And maybe you can join us on a future episode and we can talk about this some more. If you're a parent of a child who's in school right now and you'd like to talk about this, or if you're a student and you want to share your ideas and your experiences, send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. If you are interested in learning more about the work that I do as a professional coach, helping people to develop these skills, again, send me an email, scott@scottmillercoaching.com, or visit my website, scottmillercoaching.com. Love to hear from you. Thanks for joining us today.